Before getting started, this video is available ad-free as well as in audio podcast form on locals.com to monthly subscribers. It's basically Patreon, but a lot better and allows people to support the channel if they so choose. Also, my entire content library is available on Odyssey, which is just a YouTube alternative for those that want to try out a new platform, and the links are down below in the description. What is the definition of insanity? To be completely honest, the clinical definition is probably extremely complex and intricate, but a long-standing and widely famous quote from Albert Einstein reads as follows: "Insanity is doing the same thing over and over, expecting a different result." Insanity typically refers to the actions of one person, a single human being who replicates an activity again and again, thinking that somehow the next result will be entirely different. But today I want to apply that same logic to the video game genre, looter shooters. The primary reason I want to do this is quite obviously the recent Marvel Avengers game that launched during August of 2020. Avengers, under the Marvel Universe, is one of the largest and most profitable entertainment franchises in all of history, and yet the game has fallen flat on its face, like so many titles before it, because for some reason, developers within the looter shooter genre specifically continually perform the same exact tasks and create the same exact systems, expecting different results. The most important thing to remember with a genre like looter shooters is that longevity and loot acquisition is basically the entire point of the whole game. The idea is not to have a confined story arc that definitively ends. The idea is to produce a gear system that can engage the player far longer than scripted story ever could hope to compete with. This is not a new genre. It's not a unique concept. It's a thoroughly tested, mass-produced format that has hundreds, possibly thousands of historical references, and yet, somehow, these development companies continue to produce games that replicate all of the failing attributes their peers and predecessors were crippled by. Avengers has barely been out a single month. It launched September 4th, I believe, and this video is being produced October 8th. However, in that simple, short amount of time, the game has lost between 90 and 95% of its player base. Forbes writer Paul Tassi, one of the few gaming journalists who avidly follows the looter shooter genre, reports that as the concurrent player count slides below 1,000, matchmaking has begun to fall apart. An Avengers game, with all the power and brand recognition that name provides, can't even hold enough players in a looter shooter title to perform basic fundamental matchmaking. That's a problem. But here's the thing, that problem is not new. That problem is not a failed step in a long history of success owing to some sort of radical design philosophy shift. That failure is completely normal. This leads me to a kind of question. If the definition of insanity is executing the same actions over and over expecting a different result, would that still apply when separate studios have decades of experience and peer action to draw from, but simply produce the same uninteresting, broken loot systems time and time again? Are they insane? My answer is obviously yes, they must be, because it's almost intentional at this point. Looter shooter developers seem to aggressively ignore the very few examples of a successful loot system that do exist in favor of replicating everything that doesn't work from the previous few years, even the previous few months. Avengers really isn't a game I want to play. I have no interest at all. I don't have extensive first-hand knowledge of this title, but after researching the game's loot system and asking a number of currently avid players what they in particular think, the flaws are not difficult to describe, not at all. The system revolves around non-cosmetic gear progression, a seemingly unimportant distinction, but cosmetic augmentation in tandem with stat benefits can make a great deal of difference. However, it goes deeper because the only form of progression is flat and numerical. This might seem odd to say, but let me explain a bit further. The gear that you get pads your existing stats, but that gear does not really change your playstyle. It does not award you with new and powerful abilities, it does not change your appearance and bestow some sort of visible reward. It is just numbers that unlock more missions, which play out in kind of exactly the same way. The gear seems on a surface level to have augmentations that might impact gameplay and strategy, but generally speaking, from what I am told, it doesn't, at least not in a way that creates meaningful diversity and replayability. That's a problem. Looter shooters are predicated on grinding or replaying content, but the loot has to, somehow, change that content meaningfully, else there is absolutely no point. On top of this, if we recognize that the entire premise of a looter is the loot itself, which it is, it's even in the name, we must also recognize that quantity matters. Loot-based games often run into the issue of player optimization, where optimal methods of farming are discovered. Sometimes even these optimal methods of farming overcome the mistakes that developers have made with balancing, but for some reason they are routinely squashed. And drip-fed loot, in this case gear that doesn't actually change anything truly noticeable, becomes the only real trial access point to regrind content that oftentimes isn't even really new. Avengers, for some unknown reason, has either forgotten or flat out ignored that basic fundamental concept and made it so the progression is as simplistic and unimpactful as possible, other than allowing access to higher level missions. But these missions are just a raw stat check barrier, and the loot is fed into the ecosystem on a slow drip feed, which really is just the final nail in the coffin. If you don't have high enough gear power, you just lose. If you do have high enough gear power, you kind of just win by button mashing, but nothing about that loot ever really changes how you play or serves as a combination benchmark. It doesn't change what you look like or alter any sort of meaningful functionality at all. That's a problem. That is an age-old issue that far too many looter shooters have fallen prey to, and with one of the most notorious and popular brand names in all of existing entertainment, Avengers still managed to make a system so bad the game has effectively, hopefully just temporarily, died. Avengers isn't alone. Anyone remember Anthem? The game so broken that a level 1 assault rifle would outpace even the best legendaries in the entire game because the math under the hood and whatever dynamic power scaling they used was so unbelievably busted it would just jack up the values of gear so that what you had on was basically always good enough. Yeah, 3 guesses why that one started failing. Anthem even had an entire conspiracy theory on 4chan about how tragically broken the loot system was. The gist of it was that this might be some form of new AI testing ground because it was almost inconceivable that the developers had produced a loot system that badly tuned. On top of this, Anthem suffered from the same issues as many other titles do, which included, but were not limited to, duplicated skins and a feeling of uselessness to all of the gear, drip-fed items that left players feeling under-rewarded and snubbed after completing very difficult activities, and scaling which often just invalidated whatever hard work the player had done or was planning on doing completely. The game is now emblematic of failure in the entire industry, not just the genre of looter shooters. However, it isn't alone. As much as I love the original Division game because it overcame some of these problems, partially, and the sequel did a better job, in my opinion, than Avengers or Anthem did, it still had similar problems. For instance, loot was throttled down to a point where progression felt very tedious, and the discrepancies between players, better described as player choice with what they would equip and how they would build their character, was compressed through normalization in most PvP zones. Whereas PvE was constantly rebalanced downward to ensure that players were not exceeding some sort of artificially enforced and arbitrary power ceiling that the developers expected. I would describe the Division franchise as having found more success than either Avengers or Anthem, most definitely, but the general blueprint seems to almost always be the same. When a looter shooter launches, the loot is balanced poorly, lacks meaningful impact, is drip-fed into the system as players cry out in very obvious frustration, and the population of the game tanks to a point of near irrelevance. This doesn't mean it can't ever recover. There are numerous examples of a game that fell flat on its face and eventually found success. Destiny comes to mind as one of those that was met with very similar criticisms, but eventually found its legs. Anthem is getting a total revamp, and who knows, maybe it will start to crawl, then maybe walk, and eventually run, but why is it the norm to fail and fall flat, only hoping to rebuild back to a point of adequacy after the span of months, possibly years? These games don't learn from each other. Case in point, Path of Exile has overcome practically all the problems I discussed previously and was built from day one on a foundation that enabled consistent and continuous growth. Difference is, it's not a looter shooter, it's an ARPG that is predicated on loot. However, even with an entirely different genre, we can display with absolute clarity how the system easily addressed the problems that another genre either willfully neglects or is just too short-sighted to even see. First, the loot is not just plentiful, it is excessive. Normally, the word excess would come with some sort of negative connotation to it, but not here. Path of Exile drowns you in loot because it successfully understands that most of that will be uninteresting or useless. However, as the quantity rises, so too does the depth and potential for reward, and the game acknowledges this by leaning into the player's desire to access the loot table hundreds, even thousands of times in any given mission. On top of this, the entire loot system is predicated on randomization. Now, randomized rewards can sometimes, on a surface level, seem obnoxious if you're used to the alternative, but if we realign our expectations towards replayability, one of the core tenets when it comes to looter shooters, randomization is actually necessary, and increasing it, while adequately increasing quantity in tandem, allows for that replayability to be achieved. Lastly, the randomized rewards, when combined, allow for absurd and often game-altering effects. A player can stack into attributes that make their character a complete meme, with insane cast or attack speed but relatively no damage. They can go for ridiculous area of effect, but again, they fall short in other areas. And balance in the game is not always achieved. Sometimes builds or items or combinations are just off the charts and must be realigned, but that simple concept where loot impacts how the gameplay unfolds in a very, very noticeable way is absolutely critical. Looter shooters all seem to have the same or very similar issues at launch. Not enough loot, bottlenecks and throttling on how to acquire it with some sort of weekly or monthly or daily mission system. When you do acquire that loot, it fails to modify the gameplay fundamentals beyond increasing your meter damage, if that, or just pushing you over some arbitrary threshold to a new difficulty tier, where the same enemies simply have more health and damage and you get the same items with just higher individual stats. If the gear has no gameplay effect, it often in tandem has no cosmetic effect, which compounds the feeling of uselessness, as you spend days waiting to access a tightly controlled gear valve, and when you finally can, it's an item that makes a power number change, maybe not even that, but otherwise does nothing to augment your time spent playing. Destiny 2 is a perfect example of one specific issue here. The game has improved dramatically, but one area where this problem was painfully obvious is randomized roles. On launch, the developers opted to compress the gear pool and have all items come with static perk rolls. If you got a gun of the same archetype, it was identical to everyone else's gun with that same archetype, and the entire player base told them over and over and over again, "Bad idea, don't do it. We don't want this, please change it back." Well, they did change it back, among many other alterations and expansions to the existing system, but the basic premise goes back to the definition of insanity. The developers of a looter shooter game reduced the value and diversity of the loot pool on purpose. The players begged them not to, and the results were absolutely predictable. When they were finally forced to undo that idiotic decision, the player base was grateful and enthusiastic because the core principles of loot are not hard to understand. Yet somehow, newly released looter shooter games either intentionally or negligently strike out almost every single time. Avengers from the very beginning was on track for where it is now. This is not unexpected. This is true to form for the genre. The game can have all the money in the world, a historically large and enthusiastic player base, but it still gets tripped up by the most integral and important concept, which is loot. For some reason, the looter shooter genre remains, as it has for many years, a perfect example of insanity. It does the same things over and over, learning nothing from other failed launches and lackluster products, but somehow, somewhere, someone in an office out there expects a different result. Looter shooter games don't need to fall flat on their face because of the same exact problems nearly every single time a new one launches, but they do, and they will probably continue to do so, as hard as it is for me to comprehend even why, because the same issues crop up with almost every single new release, and until that changes, the same results will obviously occur. Some of them overcome this launch day cliff, whatever it is. Some of them turn the corner and become something amazing. It does happen. But the cycle of producing something with a failed blueprint and expecting that this time it won't collapse is irresponsible and insane. But that's it. If you want to support, there are links down below. Merch, locals, Odyssey, and some other social media as well. Another gaming YouTuber to support and check out, but I'll cut it there and stop rambling. As always, thank you all for watching, and have a nice night.